Before we dive into this epic tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more thrilling sci-fi adventures. The tiny alien girl trembled as she lay on the cold, metal surface of the human spacecraft, her wide eyes locked on the towering figure before her. She had heard the stories, the terrifying tales passed down through generations of her people. Humans, they said, were vicious predators, conquerors of worlds, creatures that devoured anything in their path without mercy. Her species had long lived in fear of the humans, who had gained a reputation for destroying anything they encountered. As she sat there, utterly helpless, the weight of those ancient fears pressed down on her small frame. Her people, small and fragile by human standards, had always been a peaceful race, content to live in harmony with nature. They had never sought out conflict, preferring to stay hidden from the larger, more aggressive species that roamed the galaxy. But the humans, with their towering bodies, advanced technology, and insatiable hunger for conquest, were different. They had appeared out of nowhere, sweeping through peaceful systems, annihilating entire civilizations in their wake. The alien girl's people had heard the stories of human invasions, how entire planets had fallen under their boot heels, their inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. The girl had been raised on tales of horror and warning, told that humans were to be feared above all others. These stories painted them as monstrous beings, ruthless and relentless, with no regard for life or compassion. Her parents had taught her that humans saw her kind as nothing more than a meal, a source of food for their insatiable hunger. She had heard that they would hunt down weaker species, capturing them for the sole purpose of devouring them. The girl's heart raced as she recalled those tales, the images of human soldiers tearing apart entire planets and devouring the creatures they encountered. Now here she was, alone and terrified, in the presence of a human soldier. The man stood above her, his towering form casting a shadow over her small, fragile body. His face was hardened, a mask of indifference that sent chills down her spine. She could hear the beating of her own heart in her ears as she tried to make sense of the situation. How had she ended up here? Why had they taken her? Was this the end? Would this human be the one to finally end her life, just as the stories had warned? She couldn't help but imagine the worst. The soldier might be waiting for the right moment to strike, to tear her apart with his bare hands, as her people had always believed they would. The girl's eyes flickered toward the soldier's massive hands, wondering if they would soon close around her throat, crushing the life out of her. The thought of such brutality, of being torn apart by this towering giant, made her stomach churn. She tried to shrink further into herself, praying that the human would lose interest and leave her be. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't happen. The human had captured her, and there was only one reason why, because it was what humans did. They conquered, they devoured, and they took what they wanted. The girl's mind raced as she tried to come up with some way to escape. She had been taught to hide, to stay out of sight, to never draw attention to herself in the presence of humans. But now, in the cold, sterile room of the spacecraft, she had nowhere to go. The soldier's eyes were fixed on her, his gaze calculating and cold. She had heard that humans were capable of cruelty that surpassed even the most vicious predators, but she had never truly understood the depth of that cruelty until now. The stories, the warnings, all of them had been right. As her fear deepened, the girl tried to remind herself of her people's strength, the strength that had allowed them to survive for so long. They were small, yes, but they were clever. They could adapt, learn, and survive. Perhaps she could do the same. She looked up at the soldier again, her gaze filled with desperation. Could she reason with him? Could she find a way to convince him that she was no threat, that she was just a frightened little creature? Or was she doomed to become another casualty in the humans' endless war against the galaxy? She could feel the weight of history bearing down on her shoulders, the countless generations of her people who had lived and died under the shadow of humanity's destructive power. They had always been the victims, the ones left behind in the wake of humanity's expansion. Her species had been forced to hide, to retreat, to survive at all costs. And yet here she was, in the presence of a human, helpless and alone. Was this her end? Would she be the next to fall to the hands of these relentless conquerors? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the soldier's voice, low and steady. He spoke in a language she couldn't understand, and the girl's heart skipped a beat. Was he speaking to her? Was this the moment he would strike? She braced herself, ready for the worst, but instead of the anticipated violence, the soldier simply looked at her. His expression was unreadable, but there was no sign of aggression in his posture. He didn't move to strike, didn't make any threatening gestures. For a moment, she was confused. Was this some sort of game? Was he trying to lull her into a false sense of security before he attacked? The girl shook her head, trying to clear the overwhelming fear clouding her thoughts. She needed to stay alert, to stay ready. There was no telling what the human might do next. She had heard the stories, seen the images, and she knew what humans were capable of. She couldn't let her guard down. She wouldn't. Not now. The fear clawed at her insides, but something else began to stir within her as well. Something unfamiliar, something that didn't align with the stories. A strange sense of curiosity, mixed with the faintest glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the human wasn't like the others. Perhaps this one wouldn't devour her. Perhaps. But no. She couldn't let herself believe that. She had to stay strong, to remember the stories, to remember what her people had taught her. Humans were monsters. Nothing more. And when faced with such monsters, there could be no hope. Only survival. The human continued to observe her, his cold eyes never leaving her fragile form, as she shrank further into herself, desperately hoping that the inevitable would not come. But with each passing second, the alien girl could feel the weight of the human's gaze like an invisible force pressing against her chest. She had been taught to anticipate the worst, to expect nothing but the sharp sting of death or the cruel chains of captivity. The fear that had been instilled in her since birth gnawed at her, urging her to stay small and unseen. Yet there was something in the way the human was looking at her that made no sense, something that did not fit with the terrifying stories she had heard. For as long as she could remember, her people had lived in the shadows, hiding from the mighty human empire that had spread like wildfire across the stars. They had avoided contact with them, for to do otherwise would surely be a death sentence. Her ancestors had seen the human ships arriving, with their towering engines of war, their unyielding desire to conquer and destroy. No species had been spared their wrath. From the tiniest insect-like creatures to the most advanced civilizations, humans had obliterated them all. This was not a fear born from stories or rumors. It was the cold, hard truth of the galaxy. And now, here she was, face to face with one of them. Every fiber of her being screamed for escape, but she knew there was no place to hide. She was trapped. The tiny alien girl's thoughts raced in a cycle of dread and disbelief. What could she do? How could she possibly survive this? Her tiny species, so small and fragile, had never stood a chance against the might of humans. They were no match for their physical strength, their technological superiority. The stories had always said that humans didn't care for the weak, for those who couldn't fight back. It wasn't their way to show mercy or compassion. They took what they wanted, and in a case of species like hers, what they wanted was food. The girl's heart pounded louder in her chest as she felt her body go cold with terror. She could sense the soldier's power, his indifference, as though he were a force of nature rather than a being capable of understanding her. He was an unstoppable machine, a soldier bred for war and conquest, and she was nothing more than a speck in his world. In her mind, she could already hear the sounds of the human's heavy footsteps, could already feel the sting of his teeth as he closed the distance between them. What had she done to deserve this fate? Was it her fault that her species had been at the wrong place at the wrong time? Was it her fault that they had been drawn into the terrifying web of humanity's expansion? The terror surged within her like a tidal wave, but there was another, smaller part of her mind that was starting to ask questions. Why hadn't the human attacked yet? He was still standing there, looking at her unmoving. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. She was just one small, defenseless creature against a species that had wiped out so many before her. It didn't make sense. Why wasn't he acting on the brutal impulses that had led to the destruction of countless others? What was different about her? Was this some kind of test, some cruel game humans played with their prey? She forced herself to look at him again, trying to decipher his expression. His face was still a mask of indifference, but there was something there, something she couldn't quite place. He wasn't looking at her with the same hatred or malice that had been described in the stories. His eyes didn't burn with the usual bloodlust. In fact, there was something, almost curious about the way he was studying her. It was a look she hadn't anticipated, something that confused her more than it reassured her. Could it be? Was there a possibility that this human wasn't like the others? Could he be different? Her mind fought to hold on to the fear, but a small, flickering hope was beginning to rise within her. Could this human possibly be an anomaly? She had always been taught to fear them above all else, but perhaps that was the mistake of her people. Maybe the stories had been exaggerated, twisted over the years by those who had never truly encountered a human. Perhaps not all humans were the same. The girl didn't know the answer, but her thoughts began to spin in a different direction. If this human was different, if he wasn't the monster she had always believed him to be, could there be a chance for her people to survive? Her small, delicate frame shuddered as she tried to process everything that was happening. What if her people had been wrong about humans all along? What if there was a different path, a path that didn't lead to destruction and death? The thought was almost unthinkable, but it was there. It was a whisper in the back of her mind that urged her to question everything she had been taught. The girl's breathing slowed, though her heart still raced. She dared not let her guard down completely, but the human hadn't moved. He hadn't attacked. He hadn't shown the cruel, mindless aggression that she had always associated with his kind. Could it be that humans were capable of more than just violence? Could they be capable of compassion? It seemed impossible, but in that moment, it was the only thing that made sense. What if this human was just one of the few exceptions? The girl couldn't deny the possibility. The stories had never mentioned mercy or kindness, but what if those qualities existed within humans, even if they were rare? She thought back to her own people, to their peaceful ways, to the way they had always avoided conflict. Perhaps this human, despite his brutal appearance, was simply looking for something different from the endless cycle of conquest and destruction. What if, in some small way, he had been sent to her people for a reason? What if, somehow, the universe had a different plan for her kind? Could this human be a part of that plan? It was a dangerous thought, one that threatened to undermine everything she had ever known. But as she sat there, staring into the human's eyes, she realized that she couldn't dismiss it. She couldn't ignore the possibility that something beyond violence and destruction might exist, even in a creature as seemingly terrifying as a human. Her fear began to subside, replaced by a tentative curiosity. What would happen now? Would the human continue to stand there, unmoving, or would he turn on her and destroy her without a second thought? The girl didn't know, but she felt something change in the air, something subtle and yet undeniable. It was as if the stories she had been told her entire life were beginning to unravel before her eyes. Perhaps, just perhaps, the human she feared was not the monster she had been taught to imagine. Her heart still raced, but now, there was something else growing within her. Something she hadn't expected to feel. Hope. The tiny alien girl could feel the shift within her, a subtle change in the atmosphere that wasn't born from the expected violence, but from something she hadn't dared to imagine. Hope, though small and fleeting, began to take root in her chest. It was an alien feeling, one she had never allowed herself to entertain, because her kind had never been granted such luxuries. Hope had always been a foreign concept when the only constant had been fear. Yet now, as she sat before the human, there was a peculiar tension in the air, a tension that didn't speak of an inevitable end, but of something else entirely. Her instincts still screamed at her to flee, to run as fast and as far as she could, but the rational part of her, the one that had been carefully honed over years of survival, whispered that perhaps this time was different. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was wrong about the humans. The stories, those terrifying legends, had always portrayed them as monsters, as mindless beasts who cared for nothing but destruction. But in the presence of this soldier, she could sense no immediate malice. No hunger for death. Instead, there was a cold wariness, a curious intensity, as though the human was just as confused by her existence as she was by his. The fear, so familiar and ingrained in her mind, began to falter against this unexpected shift. The girl's mind raced, conflicted between everything she had been taught and what was happening in front of her. She had been raised in the shadow of fear, surrounded by stories of human brutality, stories of civilizations swallowed up by their insatiable hunger. Her species had never had the luxury of questioning those stories. The damage done to their people by humanity's conquest was undeniable. Entire worlds had been lost, entire species wiped from the stars. Yet here she was, sitting before a human who had shown no signs of aggression. Was this some kind of trap, a manipulation to lull her into a false sense of security before the inevitable destruction? Or was this, perhaps, the first true sign that the universe was changing? It was a thought she couldn't fully accept, yet she couldn't completely dismiss it either. The fear of her people, the horror they had lived through, had always painted humans as one-dimensional monsters, beings incapable of understanding the concept of mercy. And yet, this human had not acted as she expected. He had not done what she had been taught to expect from creatures like him. Her hands, trembling from both fear and the uncertainty of the moment, clenched into fists as she tried to focus her thoughts. If this was some trick, then it was working. She was already questioning everything she had ever known. But could one human, one soldier, truly change the fate of her entire species? A cold wind of realization brushed against her mind. If it was possible for one human to show something other than the relentless thirst for conquest, what did that mean for the future of her people? Could there be others like him, humans who were different, who did not wish to wipe out every species they encountered? Her mind struggled to comprehend the idea, as though it was a foreign language she had never been taught. Yet it was there, a small flicker of possibility in the vast darkness of her thoughts. Could her people, small as they were, coexist with humans, not as prey or invaders, but as something more? She felt her breath catch in her throat as her thoughts spiraled further. What if her kind had been wrong all along? What if they had misunderstood humans, painting them with a broad brush of terror, when in reality, there was more to them than destruction? Her species had never given humans the chance to show anything other than their violent nature. They had been driven by fear, forced to hide, to run, to never allow contact with the predators that lurked just beyond their reach. But in that moment, as the human remained motionless, his expression unreadable but not hostile, she felt a strange stirring. A flicker of something that she had never allowed herself to believe. Perhaps not all humans were the same. The girl's thoughts churned as she continued to observe the human before her. His stance was not one of aggression, though his size and strength were overwhelming. He stood tall, commanding in his own right, but there was no indication that he meant to harm her. He had the power to end her life with a single motion, yet he had not. There was no callousness in his eyes, no fiery hunger. Instead, there was a level of detachment, a quiet curiosity, as though he was simply watching her, waiting for something. Was he waiting for her to make a move, to show him what she truly was? Or was he, too, trapped in a situation that neither of them fully understood? Her heart beat faster as she realized that she might be the one who had to break the silence, who had to take the first step into the unknown. She could no longer allow herself to cower in the corner of her mind, shackled by the ancient fears of her people. The stories had always told her that she would be devoured, but there was a new, terrifying thought growing within her. What if this human wasn't here to devour her? What if, instead, he was waiting for her to decide what would happen next? For the first time in her life, the girl felt a deep, unsettling unease. She was standing on the edge of something unknown, something dangerous, and the weight of her people's legacy pressed down on her like a stone. But there was something else, too. Something that felt like a doorway opening in front of her. Could she walk through it? Could she challenge everything she had ever believed and dare to hope for something different? If humans were not the monsters she had been taught to fear, what else could they be? What else could this human be? Could this human be the key to unlocking a future where her people could live without fear? Her mind raced as she thought of the stories, those terrible stories of planets lost, of species wiped out, of entire civilizations swallowed by the ever-growing human empire. But there had to be more than that. There had to be a way forward. If this human could show her that there was something beyond the cycle of violence, perhaps there was hope. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding in the shadows, to stop running. Perhaps it was time to face the possibility that the human race, in all its power and violence, also carried with it the potential for something more. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that possibility press down on her. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back from this moment. The tiny alien girl no longer felt the need to cower in fear. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to entertain the thought that perhaps humanity, in all its terrifying complexity, was not just a predator. Perhaps there was more to them, more to this human, than she had been taught to believe. The human soldier's actions, though unexpected, left an undeniable mark on the tiny alien girl. The stark reality of the situation began to settle into her mind. She was standing before a being capable of unimaginable destruction, yet he showed no interest in harming her. In fact, there was a shift in the air, a palpable sense of something more, a sense that something bigger was unfolding in front of her. She couldn't deny it. The fear that had held her in place for so long began to unravel, replaced by a complex web of emotions she couldn't quite understand. Confusion, curiosity, and most unexpectedly, a sliver of trust. She had been taught that humans were creatures of chaos, predators who would strike without mercy, driven by an insatiable desire for conquest. But everything she had been taught seemed to fall apart in this moment. The human had not shown the cruelty she had expected. He had not killed her outright, nor had he made any attempt to dominate or terrorize her. Instead, he simply observed, waiting, as though he were seeking to understand her just as much as she was seeking to understand him. The girl's thoughts were fragmented, her mind racing to catch up with the enormity of what was happening. How was it possible that this human, a being from a species that had long been painted as a monster, could inspire something so unfamiliar? She had never before felt this mixture of uncertainty and hope. Hope, something that had been long buried under layers of survival instincts and ancient teachings. Yet here she was, standing before a human and wondering if there was more to him, and to his kind, than she had ever imagined. The reality of the human's presence before her stirred a deep conflict within her. She had spent her entire life running from the stories, from the teachings passed down by her elders, who had told her to fear humans above all else. The stories spoke of worlds burning, of civilizations wiped out by the relentless march of human armies, of species erased from existence. The terror of these accounts had shaped her understanding of the universe. Fear had been her constant companion. It had been drilled into her from the moment she could comprehend language, and it had been reinforced by every encounter her people had had with humanity. But now, standing face to face with the human, she could feel the weight of that fear begin to falter. It wasn't gone entirely. It still lingered in the back of her mind, urging her to act, to flee, to survive, to protect herself. But there was something else now. A deep-seated curiosity, a gnawing desire to understand this human, this soldier, who didn't fit the mold of the monster she had been taught to fear. For the first time in her life, she questioned the validity of the stories she had grown up with. Had she been lied to? Were all humans really the ravenous beasts they had been made out to be? Could there be another side to them? The girl's body tensed as she pondered these questions, her heart racing as she struggled to find an answer. The human's expression was unreadable, a mask of quiet contemplation. She had expected to see hatred or, at the very least, indifference in his eyes, but instead there was something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't warmth, not exactly, but it wasn't hostility either. It was as if he were waiting for her to speak, to make a move. It felt like an invitation, an opening into something unknown, something that might just alter the course of everything she had ever believed. For the girl, this was a defining moment. She had spent years on the run, years hiding in the shadows, trying to avoid the inevitability of human conquest. But now, as she stood before the human, she realized that avoiding the confrontation, avoiding this very moment, would mean continuing to live in fear. She had to decide. Could she break free from the chains of fear that had bound her for so long? Could she trust that this human might be different, that there might be a chance for something beyond destruction? The girl closed her eyes for a brief moment, collecting herself. Her heart pounded in her chest as she steadied her breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions that raged within her. She could no longer afford to remain passive, to simply wait and hope that things would resolve themselves. This was her moment of choice. The stakes were unimaginable. Her people's survival, the future of her species, all hinged on this decision. She could no longer remain the terrified, helpless creature who had been taught to fear and hide. She had to stand up and face the possibility that the human before her was not the enemy, that he might not be the villain in the story her people had been taught to believe. With renewed resolve, the girl opened her eyes and fixed her gaze on the human soldier. The fear that had once consumed her had not disappeared, but it was no longer the driving force in her thoughts. Instead, there was a quiet strength building inside her. She would not be a passive victim. She would take control of her fate. And for the first time in her life, she realized that her people's future didn't have to be written by the fear of humans, by the constant dread of annihilation. Perhaps this was the moment to change everything. The soldier, who had been standing silently, watched her with a steady gaze. He did not reach for a weapon, did not take any aggressive action. His presence, though imposing, was not one of hostility. The girl could see it now, the subtle hint of curiosity in his eyes, the weight of a decision that was just as significant for him as it was for her. He wasn't just waiting for her to act. He, too, was caught in the web of uncertainty. The realization struck her with a force she wasn't prepared for. They were both trapped in the same story, the same cycle of misunderstanding. The girl had been taught to fear humans, to view them as enemies. But the truth was more complicated. The human, too, had likely been taught to see her kind as prey, as something to be eradicated. The violence between their species had been ingrained in both of them, shaping their every action, their every thought. But in this moment, standing on the precipice of their shared history, there was a chance to rewrite the narrative. There was a chance to break the cycle of violence and fear that had bound them both for so long. It wasn't an easy choice. The fear, the centuries of conflict, the stories of death and destruction, it all weighed heavily on her. But in the midst of it all, something had changed. The girl realized, with a clarity that shook her to her core, that the future of her people, and of all species, might lie in this very moment of fragile understanding. She was no longer the helpless creature hiding in the shadows. She was standing in front of the human, willing to confront the unknown, to challenge the narratives that had defined her existence. And that, in itself, was a victory. The girl had always lived with the deep-rooted certainty that humans were monsters, beasts capable of unimaginable violence and destruction. Her entire existence had been shaped by this belief. Her people had passed down these stories through generations, each one more terrifying than the last. She had grown up with the weight of these tales, knowing that humanity was a threat to everything she held dear. There was no room for doubt, there was no room for hope. It was simply survival or annihilation. But here she was, standing before this human, this soldier, whose every move defied everything she had been taught. In a strange, almost paradoxical way, he represented both the greatest threat and a flicker of something entirely new, something she couldn't quite place. His very presence was a riddle she hadn't expected to encounter. His gaze, not filled with hatred but something more nuanced, sent a shiver down her spine. Was it pity? Curiosity? Or perhaps something else? Whatever it was, it did not align with the stories she had been told. It did not match the image of a heartless predator. Her mind raced as she tried to reconcile the two conflicting truths, the human standing before her and the monstrous image she had been taught to fear. She had expected to see rage or indifference, but all she saw was a quiet determination, a calm that seemed completely out of place for someone who should have been an enemy. He was not acting like the savage warrior she had been raised to fear. Instead, he was studying her, waiting for something, perhaps for her to make a move, to show him her intentions. In that moment, something profound began to shift inside her. The fear that had paralyzed her for so long began to recede, replaced by something else, an unsettling yet powerful curiosity. Could it be that everything she had been taught was wrong? Could humans, this species she had been taught to despise, actually have something to offer? Was there a chance for something more than endless conflict? The possibility seemed absurd, yet it stirred something deep within her, something that felt like hope. She thought about her people, the ones she had left behind. They were fighting, struggling to survive, clinging to their belief that they were the victims in a galaxy ruled by merciless forces. They had long ago made peace with the idea that their future would be defined by the shadow of humanity's might. But standing here now, before the soldier, the girl began to wonder if there was another way. Could humanity be the key to something greater? Could they be an ally instead of an enemy? The thought felt dangerous, almost traitorous. How could she even entertain the possibility that the humans weren't the monsters she had always believed them to be? How could she cast aside the teachings of her people, the very foundation of her existence? But as she looked into the human soldier's eyes, she saw something that shook her to her core, a depth of understanding, of recognition, as if he, too, had been shaped by a similar set of beliefs. He, too, had likely been raised to see her species as little more than an obstacle, a threat to be eradicated. And yet, here they were, standing together, both of them unsure of the narrative they had been taught to follow. This was the turning point, the moment when both their worlds collided in an unexpected way. In her heart, the girl began to understand something crucial. This human was not the enemy. He was as much a victim of the cycle of hatred and violence as she was. They were both trapped in the same story, a story that had been written by forces beyond their control. But they had the power to change that story. They had the power to rewrite the ending. The more she reflected on it, the more it became clear to her. This moment wasn't just about her and the human soldier. It was about the future of her people, and the future of humanity as a whole. She realized that they had a choice. They could continue down the path of conflict, of destruction, until one side was left standing, or they could choose to break free from the patterns of violence that had defined their histories. It was a daunting choice, one that carried with it the weight of untold consequences, but it was a choice nonetheless. The girl's mind swirled with possibilities. She thought of the many worlds she had known, the ones her people had fought to protect, and the ones they had lost. Could it be that there was a future where her species didn't have to fight for survival against humanity? Could they coexist, even in some fragile, tenuous way? The more she thought about it, the more it seemed possible. But it would require courage, the courage to confront her own fears, to confront the stories that had shaped her understanding of the universe. The human soldier seemed to sense her internal struggle. He didn't push her, didn't demand anything from her. He simply waited, giving her the space to come to her own conclusions. It was clear that he, too, was caught in the web of his own beliefs, his own history. He had been taught that her kind was the enemy, just as she had been taught to see him as a monster. And yet, here they were, standing on the precipice of something unknown, something neither of them could predict. The girl took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. She understood now that the future was not something that could be predicted by the old stories, the old fears. It was something they could create together. But that would only happen if they both chose to let go of the hatred and the mistrust that had defined their existence for so long. She turned her gaze back to the soldier, her resolve hardening. There was no going back now. The decision had been made. The future of her people, and perhaps even of humanity, depended on this moment. And she wasn't going to let fear dictate the outcome. This was their chance, a chance to redefine the narrative, to step into a new future where both species could stand side by side, not as enemies, but as something more. What that future would look like, she didn't know. But she was willing to find out, to take that first step towards something she had never thought possible. The human soldier nodded slightly, as if understanding the silent shift that had taken place between them. Neither of them spoke, but the tension that had once filled the air had dissipated. The girl, for the first time in her life, didn't feel entirely alone in the universe. She was standing at the beginning of something new, something that could change everything. and as she met the soldier's eyes one last time, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with courage. Together, they would face whatever the future held.